The warning bells on the frigate Sword of Truth did not ring because the power died too fast. The ship drifted in the deep dark of the Mandeville Point. It was far from the light of any star. Captain Tybalt looked at his breath. It formed a cloud of white mist in the freezing air on the bridge. The life support systems were functioning perfectly a moment ago. Now the thermometer showed the temperature falling below zero. This was not a machine failure. The tech priest checked the engines and found nothing wrong. The cold came from outside the hull. It came from the empty space itself. Tybalt felt a sudden wave of sadness hit him like a physical punch. He remembered the day his brother died in the manufactorum. He remembered the time he failed his entrance exams for the Naval Academy. Every bad memory he ever had rose to the surface of his mind. He looked around the bridge. His crew members were weeping. The comms officer curled into a ball on the floor. The sensor officer stared blankly at a black screen. They were trained soldiers of the Imperial Navy. They faced orcs and pirates without fear. But this was different. This was a weaponized despair. The sensor officer managed to speak through chattering teeth. He pointed a shaking finger at the main view screen. The static cleared for a brief second. Out in the void, there was a rock. It was a jagged island of black stone floating where nothing should exist. It defied the laws of gravity. It did not orbit a planet. It simply hung in the silence. On top of the rock stood a fortress. It was triangular and tall. It had no lights. It had no visible gun turrets. It looked like a monolith of ancient death. The rock was surrounded by a swirling grey mist that the ship's sensors could not read. Inside that mist were shapes. They looked like ragged cloth drifting in a wind that did not exist. There were hundreds of them. They circled the tower like vultures waiting for a corpse. The ship's astropath screamed. It was a wet and terrible sound. The blind psyker fell from his podium. Blood ran from his nose and ears. He clawed at his head as if trying to dig out his own brain. Captain Tybalt ran to him. The astropath grabbed the captain's boot. The psyker whispered one word over and over again. He said the word Azkaban. He said it meant the place where happiness goes to die. The astropath gasped and said the prison was leaking. The minds inside were screaming so loud that they tore the fabric of the warp. These were not normal prisoners. They were souls trapped in a loop of endless misery. The sudden psychic shockwave killed the astropath a moment later. His heart simply stopped beating from the terror. Tybalt stood up. The cold was now painful. Ice formed on the inside of the glass viewports. The grey shapes in the mist turned toward the ship. They sensed the life on board. They sensed the warm emotions of the crew. They were hungry. Tybalt knew he had only one choice. He could not fight this enemy. His laser batteries would not hit smoke and shadow. He had to warn the sector command. He ran to the manual emergency beacon. It was an old system that used solid fuel rockets to launch a data pod. He recorded a voice message. He described the black tower. He described the cold. He described the grey ghost that drank hope. He punched the launch button. The pod fired away from the ship just as the lights on the bridge failed completely. The darkness was total. Tybalt heard the sound of the airlock cycle opening on the lower decks. The enemy was inside. The Sword of Truth did not explode. It did not vanish into the warp. It simply went silent. The data pod drifted for 3 weeks before a salvage team found it. The recording was played for the High Lords of the sector. They did not understand the name Azkaban. They did not know what the Black Tower was. But they understood the threat. A new power had appeared on the edge of the Imperium. It was a place of dark magic and old science. It was a resource that could be used, or a threat that must be destroyed. The bureaucracy of the Imperium began to turn its slow and heavy gears. A call was sent to the highest levels of the military. The God Emperor's fleets were moving. They would not let a prison of the damned exist without their permission. The investigation had begun. The three heads of the giant beast snapped at the air. Captain Titus held his ground. He raised his storm shield. The middle head of the monster slammed into the shield. The impact sounded like a bell ringing underwater. Titus slid back 2 feet. His boots scraped deep grooves into the stone floor. He shouted a command. The other Space Marines moved to the flanks. Brother Leandros jumped high. His jump back gave a short burst. He landed on the creature's back. He drove his combat knife into the thick hide. The beast howled. It was a sound that shook dust from the ceiling. The monster bucked like a wild horse. Leandros was thrown off. He hit the wall with a crunch of ceramite armor. The beast turned one of its heads toward Leandros. It opened its jaws. Green drool spilled out. It was acid. The liquid hit the Space Marine's leg. The armor sizzled. Leandros did not scream. He was trained to ignore pain. He rolled away. Captain Titus saw the danger. He revved his chainsaw to maximum speed. The engine screamed. He charged the beast. He aimed for the front leg. The teeth of the sword bit into muscle and bone. Blood sprayed out. It was black and thick like oil. The beast fell to one knee. It was not used to prey that fought back so hard. The fight was brutal and short. The Space Marines worked like a machine. One distracted the heads. 2 attacked the legs. 1 aimed for the heart. Within 2 minutes the beast lay dead. Its 3 tongues hung out on the cold stone. The hallway was quiet again. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the Astartes and the cooling click of their armor. Titus walked over to the corpse. He kicked it. It did not move. He looked at the wounds. The flesh was already knitting together. The beast was regenerating. It was a creature of the warp. It would not stay dead forever. Titus ordered his men to burn it. They used their flamer units to turn the body into ash. It was the only way to be sure. They moved deeper into the tower. The hallway ended at a heavy iron door. It was locked. Brother Leandros placed a melter charge on the lock. He set the timer. The team took cover. The explosion blew the door inward. They stepped through the smoke. They were in a large circular room. It was lined with cells. These cells were different from the ones below. They had no bars. They were sealed with glass. Inside the glass, the air was thick with green smoke. Titus walked up to the first cell. He wiped the frost from the glass. He looked inside. A woman sat on the floor. She wore a dress that was once expensive but was now rags. Her hair was wild and matted. She was scratching symbols into the floor with her fingernails. Titus zoomed in with his helmet lens. The symbols were not chaotic runes. They were mathematical formulas. She was trying to calculate a way out. She looked up and saw the Space Marine. She did not look afraid. She laughed. It was a silent laugh behind the glass. She pointed a finger at him. A spark of purple lightning jumped from her finger. It hit the glass and fizzled out. Titus stepped back. These prisoners were psychers. They were witches. The Imperium hated witches. Usually they were fed to the Golden Throne or shot. But here they were kept alive. Why? Titus signaled to Margos on the ship. He described the room. Margos Kane replied over the vox. His voice was full of static. He said the glass was made of noctilith. It was blackstone. It dampened psychic energy. This prison was built to hold alpha-level psychers. It was a collection of dangerous weapons. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The frost on the glass turned into solid ice. The lights on the Space Marines' armor flickered. The shadows in the corner of the room began to move. Titus raised his sword. He thought it was another attack, but the shadows did not attack him. They drifted toward the cells. It was the hooded ghosts. They passed through the stone walls. They entered the sealed cells. The prisoners screamed. It was a silent scream behind the glass. The ghost lowered its hood over the woman's face. She stopped laughing. Her eyes rolled back. The ghost was feeding on her madness. It was eating her energy. Titus realized the truth. This was not just a prison. It was a farm. The ghosts kept the prisoners alive to feed on them. They were livestock. The revelation made Titus feel sick. The Imperium was cruel, but this was something else. This was a cycle of eternal torture. He wanted to leave. He ordered his team to move. They needed to find the warden's office. They needed to find out who built this place. High above in orbit, the situation on the Hammer of Dorn was getting worse. The cold had spread to the engine decks. The plasma reactors were struggling to maintain heat. The crew was suffering. In the mess hall, a riot broke out. It started over a piece of bread. A rating named Jensen punched a cook. Within seconds, 50 men were fighting. They used trays and spoons as weapons. They screamed at each other. They were not just angry. They were filled with hate. The gloom of Azkaban was turning them against each other. The ship's commissar walked into the mess hall. He wore a long black coat and a peaked cap. He held a bolt pistol. He fired a shot into the ceiling. The noise was loud. The fighting stopped. The men looked at him. Their eyes were wild. The commissar did not shout. He spoke calmly. He told them they were soldiers of the Emperor. He told them that despair was a sin. He told them that hunger was a test of faith. He walked through the crowd. He looked Jensen in the eye. Jensen was shaking. He was crying. He said he couldn't take the cold anymore. He said he could hear his dead mother calling him. The commissar nodded. He raised his pistol. He executed Jensen where he stood. The body fell to the floor. The other crewmen stepped back. The violence of the act broke the spell of the gloom for a moment. Fear replaced depression. Fear was better. Fear made men work. The commissar ordered them back to their stations. They obeyed, but the commissar knew this was a temporary fix. He could feel the cold in his own bones. He could hear the whispers in the back of his mind. He touched the holy symbol around his neck. It felt like ice. On the bridge, Inquisitor Crowley watched the tactical display. A new alarm blared. It was the proximity alarm. Something was rising from the planet. It was not a ship. It was a cloud. The sensors magnified the image. It was the ghosts, thousands of them. They were leaving the gravity of the rock. They were flying into space. They did not need air. They did not need heat. They were moving toward the fleet. Crowley shouted orders. He told the captains to raise void shields to maximum. He told the gunnery crews to prepare point defense turrets. The ships turned their guns toward the approaching cloud. The battleship Hammer of Dorn fired its macro cannons. The shells were the size of buildings. They flew into the cloud of ghosts. They exploded in silent flashes of fire. The explosions dispersed the cloud for a second, but the ghosts reformed. They were like smoke. You cannot kill smoke with a cannon. The cloud hit the fleet. The ghosts did not stop at the void shields. The energy barriers were designed to stop lasers and solid matter. They were not designed to stop ectoplasm. The ghosts passed right through the shields. They passed through the thick armor of the hulls. They entered the ships. On the frigate Sword of Saint Sabbat, the bridge crew screamed. The ghosts drifted through the floor. The temperature on the bridge fell to absolute zero. The captain froze in his chair. His blood turned to ice crystals. The ghosts moved from person to person. They sucked the souls out of the crew. The ship went dark. It began to drift. It was a dead ship. Crowley watched the frigate die on his screen. He was horrified. He had never seen an enemy border ship like this. He activated the internal defense grid. He ordered the ship's armsmen to repel boarders. The armsmen were naval security troops. They carried shotguns and shock mauls. They ran through the corridors of the Hammer of Dorn. They met the ghosts on Deck 12. The armsmen fired their shotguns. The pellets passed through the robes. The ghosts drifted forward. The armsmen panicked. They broke formation. The ghosts descended on them. It was a massacre. Magos Kane was in the engine room. He saw the ghosts coming through the walls. He did not feel fear like a human. He felt logic. He calculated that his biological brain was at risk. He activated his logic implants. He shut down his emotional centers completely. He became a pure machine. He spoke to the tech priests around him. He ordered them to pray to the machine god. He ordered them to vent plasma from the reactor. He wanted to flood the room with superheated gas. It was a desperate move. The vents opened. White-hot plasma hissed out. The temperature in the engine room shot up to thousands of degrees. The ghosts recoiled. They hated the heat. They hated the energy. They retreated back through the walls. Magos Kane had saved the engines, but he had killed 40 servitors who were too slow to get out. He did not care. The ship could fly without servitors. It could not fly without engines. Inquisitor Crowley realized he was losing the war in space. He could not fight an enemy that could walk through walls. He needed to destroy the source. He needed to destroy the tower on the ground. But Captain Titus was still inside. Crowley grabbed the Voxcaster. He shouted for Titus. The signal was weak. The interference from the ghosts was intense. Titus heard the voice. It sounded like a ghost itself. Titus, retreat. Bombing. Run. Titus looked at his squad. They were deep in the enemy base. They had found the control room. It was a large hall with a stone table in the center. On the table was a map of the sector. It was an ancient map. It showed stars that no longer existed. Standing at the table was a figure. It was not a ghost. It was a space marine. But his armor was wrong. It was black and gold. It was covered in spikes and chains. He was a Chaos Space Marine. He was a traitor from the Black Legion. The traitor looked up. He had no helmet. His face was a map of scars. His eyes were solid black. He smiled. He held a staff topped with a skull. The skull glowed with green light. He spoke. His voice was like grinding stones. He said his name was Sorcerer Malak. He said he was the warden of this prison. He said the Imperium had forgotten this place, but the Chaos Gods had not. He had come to harvest the army of the dead. Titus did not waste words. He charged. The sorcerer waved his staff. A blast of force hit Titus. It knocked him backward. The other space marines opened fire. The sorcerer laughed. A magical shield blocked the bolts. He raised his hand. The shadows in the room came alive. They formed into blades. The shadows attacked the space marines. It was a duel of magic versus steel. Crowley on the ship made a decision. He could not wait for Titus. The fleet was dying. He had to deploy the Imperial Guard. He needed bodies on the ground to draw the ghosts away from the ships. The ghosts were attracted to misery. 10,000 terrified men would be a beacon. It was a cruel tactic. It was using his own soldiers as bait, but it was the only card he had left. He called General Stubbs. He gave the order. Deploy the Cadian 88th. Full regiment drop. Target the base of the tower. Secure the perimeter. General Stubbs did not argue. He knew the situation. He saluted. He went to the hangar bays. The alarms rang. The guardsmen lined up. They were terrified. They had heard the rumors. They knew they were dropping into hell. The sergeants shouted at them. Move, move, the Emperor protects. They filed into the Valkyrie transport ships. The ramps closed. The engines roared. Hundreds of Valkyries shot out of the launch tubes. They looked like a swarm of insects descending on the dead rock. The ghosts in space sensed the fresh meat. They turned away from the capital ships. They dove down toward the transports. This was what Crowley wanted. He watched the screen. The cloud of ghosts followed the soldiers down. The pressure on the fleet lifted. The lights on the bridge stopped flickering. The temperature rose a few degrees. But for the men in the Valkyries, the nightmare was just starting. The ghosts phased through the holes of the transports. Soldiers started dying before they even hit the ground. Pilots slumped over their controls. Dropships spiraled out of control. They crashed into the black rocks. Fireballs bloomed in the mist. The radio channels were filled with screams. "We are taking casualties. They are inside. Oh God, they are inside." General Stubbs was in the lead command ship. He drew his power sword. He shouted over the Vox, "Hold your nerve, land the birds, get out and form firing lines." His pilot was a veteran. He managed to land the ship in the courtyard. The ram dropped. Stubbs ran out. He was met by a wall of cold. The mist was thick. He saw the wreckage of other ships. He saw his men stumbling out of the burning crashes. The ghosts were swooping down like vultures. Stubbs fired his bolter. He rallied his command squad. "Form up. Laser guns at the ready. Light them up." The guardsmen formed a circle. They fired their laser guns. The red beams of light cut through the gloom. The light hurt the ghosts. It pushed them back. The sheer volume of fire created a safe zone. More ships landed. More men poured out. They set up heavy bolters. They set up mortars. They established a foothold. They were dying by the hundreds, but they were holding. Back in the tower, Titus recovered from the blast. He saw the sorcerer distracted by the sudden arrival of the army outside. The sorcerer looked at the window. He was annoyed. "Insects," he muttered. "They interfere with my work." Titus saw his chance. He signaled Brother Leandros. Leandros still had one melter bomb. Titus pointed at the floor beneath the sorcerer. Leandros understood. He rolled a grenade across the floor. It stopped right at the sorcerer's feet. The sorcerer looked down. He raised a shield. But the melter bomb was not a fragmentation grenade. It was a shaped charge designed to melt tank armor. The bomb detonated. It did not explode outward. It burned downward. It melted the stone floor instantly. The sorcerer fell through the hole. He screamed as he tumbled into the darkness of the lower levels. The magical pressure in the room vanished. The shadow blades disappeared. Titus stood up. He was battered. His armor was cracked, but he was alive. He went to the window. He looked down. He saw the war in the courtyard. He saw the thousands of tiny flashes of laser gun fire. He saw the black swarm of ghosts attacking the Imperial Guard. He knew that General Stubbs had bought them time, but he also knew that the Guard could not hold forever. They were just men. They would break. Titus turned to his squad. "We have to finish this. The sorcerer is the key. He is controlling them. We hunt him down." They moved to the hole in the floor. They jumped down into the dark. They were going into the bowels of Azkaban. On the surface, the battle turned into a slaughter. The ghosts adapted. They stopped attacking the front of the formation. They came up through the ground. They pulled soldiers down into the earth. The morale of the Cadian 88th began to crack. A platoon on the east flank threw down their weapons. They tried to run back to the ships. The ghosts caught them. It was silent and terrible. The men fell one by one. General Stubbs watched his flank collapse. He grabbed the Vox operator. "Get me the fleet. We need fire support. Danger close. Drop it on my coordinates." Crowley heard the request. He looked at the map. If he fired the ship's guns, he would kill thousands of his own men. But if he didn't, the ghosts would eat them all and then come back for the ships. It was the arithmetic of war. He looked at the gunnery officer. Target the outer perimeter of the landing zone. Fire. The macro cannons of the Hammer of Dorn spoke again. The shells screamed down from orbit. They hit the ground around the Imperial Guard position. The shockwave knocked General Stubbs off his feet. The earth shook. The explosion vaporized hundreds of ghosts. It also vaporized 3 squads of guardsmen who were too close. But the line held. The fire created a wall of death that the ghosts could not cross. The catastrophe had happened. The fleet was damaged. The ground army was trapped. The enemy was revealed to be a chaos sorcerer with an army of unkillable spirits. And the only hope lay with 5 space marines descending into the dark heart of the prison. The cold was now so deep that the very air was turning into snow. The planet was freezing over. If they did not stop the sorcerer soon, the physics of the system would break down completely. The time for tactics was over. It was now a race against entropy itself. Captain Titus hit the ground hard. He rolled to absorb the impact. His armor crunched against the stone floor. He was in a large subterranean chamber. The air here was different. It was stale and smelled of ozone. The rest of his squad landed around him. They checked their weapons. They were deep underground. The light from the surface did not reach this far. They switched on their tactical lumen lights. The beams cut through the darkness. They revealed a maze of pillars and archways. This was not a natural cave. It was a built structure. The architecture was older than the Imperium. It was smooth black stone with no seams. Titus checked his Auspex scanner. The screen was filled with static. The interference was coming from the walls themselves. He could not track the sorcerer Melek. He could only follow the trail of warp energy. It left a faint purple glow on the floor. Titus pointed the way. The squad moved out. They walked in silence. The only sound was the heavy thud of their boots. They passed rows of cells. These were not like the ones above. These were sarcophagi. There were stone coffins standing upright. They were sealed with heavy chains. Some of the chains were broken. The coffins were empty. Suddenly, the ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. A low moan echoed through the hall. It sounded like the earth itself was in pain. Brother Leandros stopped. He pointed his bolter at the shadows. He said he heard voices. The voices were whispering his name. Titus told him to focus. It was a trick of the enemy. The warp tried to break their minds because it could not break their armor. They pressed on. The trail of the sorcerer led them to a massive circular door. It was covered in runes that glowed with a sick green light. The door was open. Inside, they found a laboratory. It was filled with glass tanks. Inside the tanks were things that should not exist. There were hybrids of human and xenos. There were bodies with extra limbs. There were heads floating in jars. This was where the prison wardens had experimented on the inmates. In the center of the room was a workbench. On it lay a map. Titus looked at it. It was a diagram of the prison's energy grid. It showed that the entire island was a machine. The tower was just the antenna. The real mechanism was below. The machine was designed to siphon the psychic energy of the prisoners and feed it into something at the core. Titus realized the sorcerer was not just trying to release the prisoners. He was trying to overload the machine. If he did that, the explosion would wipe out the entire system. It would create a new eye of terror. A warp rift would swallow the fleet. Titus smashed the table with his fist. They had to move faster. They left the lab and ran deeper into the dark. High above, on the surface, General Stubbs was fighting a losing battle. The orbital bombardment had bought them some time, but the enemy was adapting. The ghosts had stopped charging in a swarm. Now they were using tactics. They came from the ground. They phased through the rocks. They grabbed soldiers by the ankles and pulled them down. The screams of the men were cut short as they were dragged into the earth. The cold was the real killer. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The power packs of the laser guns were draining fast. The batteries could not hold a charge in this cold. The soldiers had to keep them warm against their bodies, and when they tried to fire, the guns would sputter and die. The heavy bolters were jamming. The oil in the mechanisms had turned to glue. The crews had to strip the weapons and clean them with bare hands. Their fingers turned black with frostbite. Stubbs walked the line. He looked at his men. They were huddled in shallow trenches. Their uniforms were stiff with ice. Their eyes were hollow. They had seen things no human should see. Stubbs knew they were close to breaking. He needed to give them hope. He stood on a crate of ammo. He yelled at them. He told them that reinforcements were coming. He told them that the Emperor was watching. It was a lie. He knew the fleet was trapped. He knew no one was coming. But a general must lie to keep his army alive. Then the second catastrophe struck. It started with the dead bodies. There were thousands of corpses in the courtyard. Dead guardsmen, dead pilots, dead crew. They were frozen solid. But then, the mist turned green. It rolled over the piles of dead. The bodies began to twitch. The ice on their joints cracked. They stood up. They did not breathe. Their eyes were white and empty. They picked up their weapons. A soldier named Corporal Jenkins saw his best friend stand up. His friend had died an hour ago from a ghost attack. Jenkins called out to him. The dead friend turned. He raised his laser gun. He fired. The beam hit Jenkins in the chest. Jenkins fell. The trench erupted in chaos. The dead were fighting the living. The enemy was inside the perimeter. It was a massacre. Soldiers hesitated to shoot their comrades. That hesitation got them killed. Stubbs saw his command squad get overrun. He drew his power sword. The energy field crackled. He cut the head off a zombie. He shouted orders. Destroy the heads. They are not your friends. They are puppets. Fire! Fire! The guardsmen rallied. They fired point blank into the faces of the dead. The courtyard became a slaughterhouse. Brother fought brother. The morale of the Cadian 88th shattered. They were not fighting an alien army. They were fighting their own past. In orbit, the situation on the Hammer of Dorn was critical. Margos Kane was on the bridge. He had plugged his brain directly into the ship's sensor array. He was reading the energy spikes from the planet. He saw a pattern. The energy was not random. It was a signal. It was a code. The pulses were counting down. Kane disconnected from the machine. He turned to Inquisitor Crowley. He spoke in a flat, metallic voice. He said the prison was unlocking. The containment fields were failing. Crowley asked what that meant. Kane explained. The prison had levels. The top levels were for common criminals. The middle levels were for psychers. The bottom levels were for things that could not be killed. They were for entities that were too dangerous to exist in reality. The lockdown was the only thing keeping them in stasis. If the field failed, they would wake up. Suddenly, the ship shook violently. The lights died. The emergency red lighting bathed the bridge in blood-colored gloom. The tactical officer screamed. He pointed at the main screen. The view of the planet had changed. The black tower was glowing. A beam of purple light shot up from the peak. It punched a hole in the clouds. It hit the void shields of the fleet. The impact was massive. The frigate Eternal Vigilance was caught in the beam. The ship did not explode. It simply twisted. The metal hull warped like wet clay. The ship folded in on itself. It was crushed by gravity. Then it vanished. It was pulled into the warp. Crowley watched a capital ship die in seconds. He felt a cold sweat on his back. This was not just a prison break. This was a ritual. The sorcerer was using the prison as a catalyst. He was turning the planet into a sacrifice. Crowley looked at the communications panel. He tried to hail Titus. There was only static. He tried to hail General Stubbs. He heard only screams and the sound of wind. He was alone. Crowley made a hard choice. He ordered the fleet to pull back to high orbit. He could not risk losing more ships. He was abandoning the ground troops. It was a death sentence for the 10,000 men on the rock. But he had to save the battleships. The engines fired. The massive vessels turned slowly. They moved away from the gravity well. The soldiers on the ground looked up. They saw the stars moving away. They saw the engines of their salvation burning retreat. They knew they were dead. Down in the dark, Titus felt the tremors. The walls of the labyrinth were shifting. The corridors were changing direction. The sorcerer was manipulating the architecture. Titus saw a figure ahead. It was Malak. The sorcerer stood on a bridge over a chasm. Below the bridge was a pit of green fire. Malak held his staff high. He was chanting in a language that hurt the ears. It was the dark tongue of chaos. Titus charged. He ran across the bridge. The stones crumbled under his feet. Malak turned. He smiled. He did not defend himself. He pointed his staff at the pit. "Too late, Space Marine," he said. "The sleeper has awakened." A massive hand rose from the fire. It was made of shadow and bone. It was the size of a tank. It grabbed the edge of the bridge. A creature pulled itself up. It was a demon prince. It had wings of tattered leather. It had horns that scraped the ceiling. It was a creature of pure hate. It roared. The sound wave hit Titus like a physical wall. He was thrown back. He hit the wall. His vision blurred. The demon prince looked at Malak. It did not thank him. It swatted him aside. Malak flew into the wall and crumpled. The demon did not care about the sorcerer. It only cared about freedom. It looked at Titus. It recognized the armor of the Astartes. It hated the Emperor's angels. It stepped forward. The bridge shook. Titus stood up. His armor was locked. The servos were damaged. He forced his legs to move. He raised his sword. He knew he could not kill this thing alone. He needed help. He shouted to his squad, "Form up. Target the knees. Bring it down." The Space Marines opened fire. The bolts exploded against the demon's skin. The creature laughed. It was immune to pain. It swung a massive sword of fire. It cut Brother Valius in half. The top half of the Space Marine fell into the pit. The bottom half stood there for a second before falling. Titus felt a surge of rage. He ran forward. He slid under the swing of the fire sword. He thrust his chainsword into the demon's belly. The blade stuck. The demon looked down. It grabbed Titus by the head. It lifted him up. Titus dangled in the air. The demon squeezed. The helmet began to crack. The warning runes flashed in Titus's eyes. Structural integrity critical. Oxygen levels falling. Titus struggled. He reached for his belt. He pulled a crack grenade. He jammed it into the wound in the demon's stomach. He pulled the pin. The demon roared and threw him. Titus flew across the room. He hit the ground. The grenade exploded. A chunk of the demon's flesh was blown away. Black ichor sprayed everywhere. The creature stumbled. It was hurt, but it was not dead. It began to heal. The flesh knitted together. Titus gasped for air. His helmet was broken. He ripped it off. The air was toxic. He held his breath. He looked at his remaining men. There were only 3 left. They were tired. They were broken. They could not win this fight. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the noise of battle. It was a mechanical hum. It came from the walls. The black stone began to glow green, not the purple of chaos, but the emerald green of the Necrons. The walls opened. Panels slid back. Out of the alcoves stepped metal warriors. They were skeletons made of living metal. They held Gauss flares. They did not look at the Space Marines. They looked at the demon. The Necrons were the ancient guardians of this prison. They had been asleep for millions of years. The Chaos Ritual had woken them up. Their programming was simple. Contain the breach, destroy the intruder. The Necron warriors raised their guns. They fired a volley of green energy. The beams hit the demon. They stripped the flesh from its bones. The demon screamed in true pain. Its warp energy was being unmade by the science of the Necrons. Titus watched in shock. The enemy of his enemy was here. But the Necrons were not allies. They were machines of death. Once they killed the demon, they would kill the Space Marines. It was a three-way war. Titus made a tactical decision. Fall back. Let them fight. Retreat to the elevator. The squad scrambled back. They ran toward the service lift they had passed earlier. Behind them, the battle of monsters raged. The demons smashed the Necrons. The Necrons kept coming. They repaired themselves. They were relentless. Back on the surface, the catastrophe escalated again. The ground began to split. The Necron awakening was reshaping the island. Huge monoliths of black stone erupted from the courtyard. They crushed the tanks of the Imperial Guard. They crushed the zombies. The monoliths began to pulse with green lightning. The lightning arc between the towers vaporized everything it touched. General Stubbs was thrown into a crater. He looked up. A monolith towered over him. A portal opened on its face. Out floated a Necron destroyer. It was a floating platform with a skeletal torso. It had a heavy cannon mounted on its arm. It aimed at the survivors of the command squad. Stubbs closed his eyes. He waited for death, but the destroyer did not fire at him. It spun around and fired at a swarm of ghosts that were attacking. The ghosts were disintegrated. The battlefield was total chaos. The Imperial Guard was caught in the middle of a war between the undead and the machines. The zombies were fighting the Necrons. The ghosts were fighting everyone. The humans were just collateral damage. Stubbs saw a chance. The Necrons were distracted. He grabbed his Vox. All units, fall back to the landing zone. The heavy lift shuttle is inbound. Move or die. The shuttle was a heavy transport called the Iron Mule. It was piloted by a madman named Bragg. He had disobeyed the order to retreat. He brought his ship down through the lightning and the ghosts. He slammed it onto the fractured landing pad. The ramp dropped. "Get in! Get in now!" he screamed over the loudspeakers. The guardsmen ran. They threw away their heavy gear. They carried their wounded. They scrambled up the ramp. Stubbs was the last one. He stood at the bottom of the ramp. He fired his bolter at a zombie that was grabbing a soldier's leg. He kicked the zombie in the face. He dragged the soldier inside. The ramp closed. The shuttle lifted off. It took hits from the Necron Gauss fire. The hull sparked, but the engines held. The Iron Mule clawed its way into the sky. Stubbs looked out the viewport. The island of Azkaban was changing. The triangular tower was gone. It had unfolded. It was now a giant floating pyramid. It was a Necron tomb world ship. It had been disguised as a rock for eons. Now it was fully awake, and it was rising. In the depths, Titus and his men reached the elevator. They hit the button. The gears ground. The platform started to rise. They were leaving the lab, but they were not safe. The shaft was full of flying scarabs. The metal beetles swarmed the elevator. They ate through the cables. The elevator jerked. It stopped. They were trapped between levels. Titus looked up. He saw the shaft stretching up for miles. He looked down. He saw the green glow of the Necron army chasing them. Then the comms bead in his ear crackled. It was Magos Kane. "Captain Titus, do not move. I have locked onto your teleport Homer. I am bringing you out." Titus was confused. Teleportation was dangerous through a warp storm. It could merge a man with a wall, or send him into space without a suit. "It is too risky, Magos," Titus shouted. "The alternative is death," Kane replied. "Initiating extraction." The world turned white. Titus felt his body being pulled apart atom by atom. It was agony. He felt the cold of the void. He felt the heat of the engines. Then, silence. He hit a metal deck face first. He tasted blood. He opened his eyes. He was on the teleportarium pad of the Hammer of Dorn. His squad was with him. They were smoking. Their armor was scorched. But they were alive. Titus stood up. He staggered. He looked at Inquisitor Crowley. Crowley looked grim. "You failed, Captain," the Inquisitor said softly. Titus was angry. "We found the truth. It is a Necron tomb. The sorcerer woke it up." "I know," Crowley said. He pointed to the view screen. Titus looked. The Pyramid of Azkaban had broken free of the planet's gravity. It was moving. It was not attacking the fleet. It was ignoring them. It was aligning its engines for a jump. But the wake of its movement was destroying reality. The hole it left in the universe was bleeding raw warp energy. The rift was opening. The Dementor ghosts were pouring out of the rift in billions. They were spreading into the sector. The sorcerer Malak had lost his life, but he had won the war. He had triggered the failsafe. The Necrons were leaving, and they were leaving the door to hell wide open behind them. The fleet was now drifting in a sea of ghosts. The navigators were blind. The engines were stalling. The cold was absolute. The catastrophe was complete. The mission had gone from a rescue op to a survival scenario. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey in a haunted galaxy. Crowley turned to the comms officer. "Send a distress signal. Priority Vermilion. Tell Terra that the Azkaban gate has fallen. Tell them." He paused. He looked at the endless grey cloud of ghosts on the screen. "Tell them to send the Grey Knights. Tell them we are damned. The fleet powerless, the guard decimated and retreating, and the ancient Necron prison ship vanishing into the deep void, leaving a wound in space that would bleed monsters for 1,000 years. The story of Azkaban was no longer about a prison. It was about the start of a new long night. The narrative paused there, hanging on the edge of total defeat. The strategic situation was impossible. The resources were gone. The morale was broken. The only thing left was the stubborn refusal of the Imperium to die quietly. This concluded the second phase of the chronicle. The escalation was absolute. The enemy was redefined. The stakes were raised to the survival of the sector. The next phase would determine if anyone would live to tell the tale. The silence on the bridge of the Hammer of Dorn was heavy. It was the silence of men who knew they were already ghosts. Wait. The silence was broken. A single ping on the radar. Not a ghost. Not a Necron. A ship. A small, fast ship entering the system from the warp. It bore the sigil of the Inquisition, but it was black. It was a black ship. The reinforcements had arrived, but they were not the kind that brought hope. They were the kind that brought a purge. The arrival of the black ship meant that the Imperium had decided to clean up the mess, and cleaning up usually meant burning everything that had seen the failure, including the witnesses. Crowley looked at the new contact. He did not smile. He knew the protocol. If you cannot contain the breach, you destroy the evidence. The first real catastrophe was over. The strategic chain reaction was about to begin. The fleet was now caught between the ghosts outside and the executioners arriving from Terra. There was no way out. The story remained poised on the brink. The simple soldiers were freezing. The mighty Astartes were battered. The commanders were out of options. The history of the Azkaban incident had turned its darkest page. The arrival of the black ship did not bring relief. It brought a silence deeper than the void. The vessel was named the Silent Judge. It was a cruiser of the Ordo Hereticus. Its hull was matte black, designed to absorb sensor scans. It did not hail the fleet. It did not ask for status reports. It simply glided through the debris field of the battle. The ghosts that swarmed around the Hammer of Dawn recoiled from the black ship. They scattered like fish before a shark. The ship projected a field of anti-psychic dampening. It was a null field. For the crew of the Hammer of Dawn, this field felt like a sudden pressure in the skull. It was the feeling of being in a room where the air had been sucked out. The headache was instant and blinding. Inquisitor Crowley stood on the bridge. He watched the black prow approach. He knew what was coming. The black ships gathered the tithe of psychers from across the galaxy. They were floating prisons, but they were also the chariots of the Sisters of Silence. The Sisters were blanks. They had no souls. They were the ultimate weapon against the warp, but they were also the ultimate sign of judgment. If they were here, it meant Terra considered this system lost. The Silent Judge docked with the Hammer of Dawn. The clamps locked with a sound that vibrated through the hull. The airlock cycled. Crowley went to meet them. He took Captain Titus with him. He wanted the transhuman presence of the Astartes as a reminder of their strength. The airlock opened. A squad of women walked out. They wore gold armor. They carried bolters and greatswords. Their faces were masked. They did not speak. They could not speak. They had taken vows of silence. Behind them walked a man in red robes. He was High Inquisitor Vane. He was younger than Crowley, but his eyes were hard as flint. He held a staff of office topped with the winged skull of the Inquisition. Vane did not offer his hand. He looked at Crowley. He looked at the frost on the walls. He looked at the tired, shivering crew. He spoke one sentence. He said that Inquisitor Crowley was relieved of command. He said the fleet was now under the jurisdiction of the Purgation Fleet. Crowley argued. He said they had gathered vital intelligence. He said the Necron threat was real. Vane raised a hand. He said intelligence was useless if the Gatherer was corrupted. He said the crew had been exposed to the touch of the warp for too long. They were compromised. Captain Titus stepped forward. He towered over Vane. The Space Marine's armor was scarred from the battle with the demon. He said his men were not compromised. He said they were the Emperor's chosen. Vane looked up at the giant. He did not blink. He said even angels could fall. He reminded Titus of the Horus heresy. It was a low blow. Titus clenched his fist. The servos in his gauntlet whined. The Sisters of Silence raised their weapons. The tension in the hallway was absolute. It was a standoff between three branches of the Imperium's military. Vane broke the silence. He said he had a mission. The rift left by the Necron ship was expanding. The ghosts were pouring out. He called them warp specters. He said they were a threat to the segmentum. He had a plan to close the rift. But first, he had to secure the fleet. He ordered the Hammer of Dawn to lower its shields. He ordered the crew to assemble in the cargo bays for screening. Screening meant execution for anyone who stuttered. Crowley surrendered. He had no choice. To fight Vane was to fight the High Lords of Terror. He handed over his rosette. He was escorted to the brig. Titus was allowed to remain free, but he was ordered to keep his squad in their quarters. The Iron Wardens were effectively grounded. The purge began an hour later. The stormtroopers from the Silent Judge moved through the ship. They went to the lower decks. They found the crewmen who were suffering from the despair sickness. They did not treat them. They shot them. The sound of last fire echoed in the corridors. Bodies were thrown out of the airlocks. The morale of the fleet, already low, collapsed completely. There was no mutiny yet, only terror. The crew worked with their heads down. They were more afraid of the Inquisitor than the ghosts outside. But the strategic situation changed again. The ghosts were not mindless. They had learned from the battle. They saw that the black ship was a zone of death for them. The null field hurt them. So they changed tactics. They did not attack the black ship. They attacked the wounded ships on the edge of the formation. The frigate Emperor's Mercy had lost its engines in the earlier fight. It was drifting. The ghosts descended on it. But they did not just kill the crew. They possessed the ship itself. The sensors on the Hammer of Dorn screamed a warning. The dead frigate was powering up. Its reactor was critical. But the heat signature was wrong. It was cold fusion. The flames from the engine were blue and grey. The ship turned. It aimed its prow at the black ship. The ghosts were using the frigate as a kinetic missile. They were going to ram the Silent Judge. Vane was on the bridge. He saw the threat. He ordered the Silent Judge to evade. But the black ship was heavy and slow. It was still clamped to the Hammer of Dorn. The release mechanism jammed. The ice had frozen the clamp shut. The two ships were locked together. Vane shouted at the tech priests. He ordered them to blow the clamps. It was too late. The possessed frigate slammed into the side of the Hammer of Dorn. It did not hit the black ship directly. It hit the battleship that was anchoring it. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screamed. The hull of the Hammer of Dorn buckled. Decompression alarms blared. The force of the crash tore the docking clamps free. The Silent Judge was thrown loose, but the Hammer of Dorn was crippled. The impact site was open to space. And from the wreck of the frigate the boarders came. These were not just the floating ghosts. These were the crew of the frigate. They were dead. They were frozen zombies, animated by the gestalt will of the Azkaban entities. They carried weapons. They knew how to open doors. They swarmed into the breach. Captain Titus did not wait for orders. He heard the crash. He grabbed his bolter. He rallied his squad. They ran toward the impact zone. They met the enemy in the corridor of Deck 9. The zombies were moving fast. They fired laser guns with perfect accuracy. They did not flinch. Titus fired back. His bolts blew the zombies apart. But for every one he killed, 2 more climbed through the hull breach. The Sisters of Silence joined the fight. They moved like gold blurs. Their greatswords cut through the zombies. When a sister killed a zombie, the spirit animating it was destroyed instantly. The null field severed the connection to the warp. The sisters were effective, but there were only 10 of them on this deck. There were thousands of zombies. Vane hailed Titus over the Vox. He did not apologize for the earlier tension. He gave a new order. He said the rift was the source of the control. The ghosts were being directed by a signal from the other side of the gate. He planned to launch a psych-out torpedo into the rift. This weapon carried the ashes of dead pariahs. It was anathema to the warp. It would collapse the gate. But the torpedo launchers on the Silent Judge were damaged by the collision. He needed the Hammer of Dorn to fire the weapon. Titus checked the status of the ship. The gunnery deck was overrun. The auto-loaders were jammed. The torpedo could not be loaded remotely. It had to be loaded manually. That meant someone had to go into the gunnery deck, fight through the army of the dead, and hoist a 3-ton warhead into the tube. Titus accepted the mission. It was suicide, but it was the only way to stop the invasion. He called General Stubbs. He needed bodies. He needed a wall of meat to hold back the tide while the Space Marines loaded the gun. Stubbs was in the cargo bay, awaiting execution by the Inquisition. When the call came, he laughed. He told his men that they were dead anyway. They might as well die fighting monsters instead of waiting for a firing squad. The Cadian 88th armed themselves. They took weapons from the dead stormtroopers. They marched up from the cargo bay. The two forces met at the entrance to the gunnery deck. Space Marines and Imperial Guard. They looked at the heavy blast doors. Beyond them lay the infested deck. Titus nodded to Stubbs. Stubbs lit a cigar. He kicked the door release. The door slid open. The deck was a nightmare. The air was full of freezing fog. The zombies were everywhere. They were manning the ship's own defense turrets. They turned the internal heavy bolters on the doorway. The slaughter began instantly. The guardsmen charged into the fire. They died in droves. But their bodies created cover for the ones behind. They pushed forward. They established a firing line behind the macro cannon shells. Titus and his squad acted as the spearhead. They smashed through the zombie ranks. They reached the torpedo hoist. The mechanism was frozen. Brother Leandros ripped the cover off the control panel. He hot-wired the crane. The chains rattled. The massive psych-out torpedo was lifted from the rack. It was painted black with gold warnings. It hummed with anti-energy. The zombies sensed the danger. They focused all their fire on the torpedo. If they detonated it here, the whole ship would die. Titus stood in front of the warhead. He used his own body as a shield. Bolt rounds sparked off his armor. He shouted at his brothers to hurry. The crane moved agonizingly slow. The torpedo slid into the tube. The breech locked. "Fire!" Titus yelled. On the bridge, the gunnery officer pressed the rune. The ship shuddered. The torpedo shot out of the tube. It flew across the void. It trailed a wake of black smoke. It headed straight for the purple tear in the universe. The collision was silent. The torpedo entered the rift. For a second, nothing happened. Then the reaction began. The anti-psychic matter reacted with the raw warp energy. It was like throwing water into hot oil. The rift did not close. It shattered. The psych-out explosion destabilized the local reality. The tear didn't seal. It fractured into 1,000 smaller tears. A shockwave of psychic feedback hit the fleet. Every soul on every ship felt it. It was a scream of 1 billion dying minds. On the Hammer of Dorn, the zombies simply collapsed. The animating force was disrupted. They fell like puppets with cut strings. The immediate threat on the deck was over. But outside, the disaster escalated. The fractured rift was unpredictable. Gravity waves distorted the space around the fleet. The ships were pulled in different directions. The Hammer of Dorn was spun around. The Silent Judge was pushed away. And then, the true horror of the chain reaction revealed itself. The feedback loop hit the cargo of the black ship. The Silent Judge was carrying thousands of unsanctioned psychers in cryostasis. The shockwave woke them up, and it drove them instantly insane. The null field of the sisters was overloaded by the sudden surge of psychic energy. The black ship became a beacon of agony. Inquisitor Vane screamed over the Vox. "Containment breach! The cargo is loose. They are merging." Titus looked out the viewport. The black ship was glowing. Light was pouring from its portholes. It was not the clean light of the Emperor. It was the multicolored sickness light of the warp. The hull of the Silent Judge began to expand. It was bloating. The metal was stretching like skin. The thousands of psychers inside were melting together. Their flesh and their souls were fusing into a single entity. The black ship was becoming a demon engine. This was the chain reaction. The attempt to close the gate had created a monster. The Silent Judge exploded outward. Debris flew everywhere. From the wreckage rose a creature of metal and meat. It was the size of a city. It had the prow of the ship for a head. It had cables for tentacles. It had the screaming faces of the psychers embedded in its armor. It was an abomination. The abomination turned toward the fleet. It was hungry. It fired beams of psychic fire from its eyes. The beams hit the cruiser Iron Duke. The cruiser's void shields failed instantly. The ship was turned into glass. It shattered into dust. Titus watched the destruction. He realized they had made a mistake. They had treated the warp like a physics problem. They had tried to solve it with a bomb. But the warp was not physics. It was emotion. And they had just fed it a bomb made of pain. Inquisitor Crowley was released from the brig by a sympathetic guard when the power failed. He ran to the bridge. He found the crew in shock. The acting captain was dead from the feedback. Crowley took the command throne. He saw the abomination. He saw the fractured rifts. He knew they could not fight this. "We have to run," Crowley said. "Emergency warp jump, now." The navigator shook his head. He was bleeding from the eyes. "We cannot jump, my lord. The turbulence is too high. We will be torn apart. If we stay, we are dead," Crowley said. "If we jump, we might survive. Calculate a micro jump. Just get us out of the system. Get us to the Mandeville point." The navigator nodded. He began the calculations. The engines of the Hammer of Dorn groaned. They were damaged. They could only give 40% power. It would be a slow run. The abomination saw the battleship moving. It roared. The sound was broadcast on all frequencies. It propelled itself through space on wings of psychic fire. It was faster than the battleship. It was catching up. Titus arrived on the bridge. He saw the situation. He saw the monster chasing them. He looked at Crowley. "It will catch us before we can jump." Crowley nodded. "We need a distraction. We need something to slow it down." Titus looked at the tactical map. There was only one thing large enough to distract that monster. It was the Necron pyramid. The tomb ship was still on the edge of the system, charging its drive for a galactic jump. If they could lure the abomination toward the Necrons, the two super threats might fight each other. "We have to turn the ship," Titus said. "We have to fly toward the Necrons." "That is suicide," Crowley said. "The Necrons will shoot us down." "The Necrons are logical," Titus argued. "They will target the biggest threat. That thing is a creature of the warp. The Necrons hate the warp more than they hate us. They will fire on it." It was a desperate gamble. It required flying a crippled ship between a demon god and a star god, but they had no other cards to play. Crowley gave the order. The Hammer of Dawn turned. It limped toward the distant green glow of the pyramid. The abomination followed. It did not care about the Necrons. It only wanted the souls on the battleship. It closed the distance. Its tentacles reached out. They were miles long. One tentacle smashed into the rear engine deck of the Hammer of Dawn. The ship bucked. The rear void shields collapsed. "We are hit," the helm officer screamed. "Engine 2 is gone." Titus grabbed the Vox. "General Stubbs, get your men to the rear gunnery decks. Manual fire on that tentacle." Stubbs, who was still alive and covered in zombie gore, acknowledged. The guardsmen ran to the rear of the ship. They manned the autocannons. They fired blindly into the mass of flesh and metal trailing the ship. It was like shooting a mountain with a pistol, but it was enough to annoy the beast. It pulled the tentacle back to strike again. That hesitation saved them. They entered the firing range of the Necron pyramid. The tomb ship's sensors detected the massive spike of warp energy approaching. The Necron overlord inside the pyramid analyzed the threat. He saw the Imperial ship as a gnat. He saw the abomination as a plague. The logic circuits made a decision. The pyramid rotated. The capstone opened. A particle whip cannon emerged. It fired a beam of green lightning. The beam was thick as a moon. It missed the Hammer of Dawn by a kilometer. It hit the abomination square in the chest. The impact was blinding. The abomination shrieked. The Necron energy flayed the metal skin from its body. The trapped souls inside were vaporized. The creature recoiled. It forgot about the battleship. It turned its rage on the pyramid. It fired its own psychic beams. The two titans clashed in the void. Green lightning met purple fire. The space between them boiled. "Now," Crowley shouted, "engage warp drive." The navigator punched the coordinates. The Geller field generator kicked in. It created a bubble of reality around the ship. The warp engines tore a hole in space. The hammer of Dorn slid into the hole. The view of the battle vanished. The stars were replaced by the swirling madness of the Imperium. They were in the warp, but they were not safe. The jump was blind. They had no beacon to guide them. The Astronomicon, the light of the Emperor that guided all ships, was dim here. The storm they had left behind was blocking the signal. They were drifting in the ocean of hell without a compass. The ship lost in the warp. The physical battle was over, but the spiritual battle had begun. The crew was exhausted. Their numbers were halved. They had lost the black ship. They had lost the system. They had created a monster and left it fighting an ancient evil. The chain reaction had resulted in a complete loss of strategic control. In the medical bay, the apothecary attended to the wounded. He found something disturbing. The men who had been bitten by the zombies but survived were not healing. The wounds were turning black. The infection was spreading. And on the bridge, the astropath woke up from a coma. He grabbed Crowley's arm. He whispered a message. He said that something had followed them into the warp. Not the abomination. Something smaller. Something that had been waiting in the rift. Crowley looked at the shadows in the corner of the bridge. The lights were dim. The Geller field was fluctuating. He realized that the Azkaban influence was not gone. The ghosts were no longer outside the ship. They were in the walls. The despair was in the air recyclers. The escape was a lie. They had brought the predestined with them. The strategic situation had shifted from a military engagement to a psychological siege. The Hammer of Dawn was now a haunted house floating in hell. The supplies were critical. The food was running out. The water was tainted. And the Inquisition, in the form of the now dead Vane, had stripped them of their authority. If they ever emerged back into real space, they would be branded heretics. They were rogue elements. Titus sat in the armory. He took off his helmet. He looked at the dents and scratches. He began to repair his gear. He knew the war was not over. He told his remaining brothers to pray, not for victory, but for endurance. The simple act of fixing a bolter became a ritual of defiance. In the dark, work was the only prayer that mattered. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent ship. It was a reminder that the metal was tired. The machine was dying, and the men inside were not far behind. The chain reaction had not stopped. It had just moved to a new phase, the phase of attrition. The chronometer on the bridge of the Hammer of Dawn had stopped working. It was stuck on the hour of the wolf. Time in the warp did not move in a straight line. It moved in loops. It moved in knots. For the crew, it felt like they had been drifting for years. In reality, it might have been days. The ship was a metal island in a sea of madness. Outside the hull, the colors of the warp screamed against the viewports. The shutters were closed. To look outside was to invite insanity. But the madness was getting in anyway. The Geller field, the bubble of reality that protected the ship, was thinning. It flickered like a dying candle. Every time it flickered, the temperature dropped. Every time it flickered, someone on the lower decks disappeared. The food was the first thing to run out. The collision with the black ship and the battle with the abomination had destroyed the main supply bays. The macro storage lockers were vented into space. There were 10,000 Imperial guardsmen, 500 naval crew, and a handful of Astartes on board. There were rations for 2 days. Captain Titus walked through the barracks of the Cadian 88th. The soldiers were lying on the deck plates. They were not sleeping. They were conserving energy. They were too weak to stand. General Stubbs sat on a crate. He was sharpening his knife. It was a meaningless action, but it kept his hands busy. He looked at Titus. His face was gaunt. His eyes were sunk deep in his skull. He asked if there was any word from the bridge. Titus shook his head. The crisis was simple arithmetic. They had too many mouths and not enough protein. The moral choice was heavy. In the Imperium, soldiers were resources. When a laser gun ran out of power, you recharged it. When a soldier ran out of food, you usually let him starve if the mission required it. But there was no mission here. There was only survival. Inquisitor Crowley called a council in the strategy room. The room was dark. The hologram table was powered down to save energy. Magos Kane was there. He looked worse than the men. His biological parts were grey and rotting. His mechanical parts were rusting. The dampness of the ship was killing his circuits. He spoke with a glitch in his voice. He presented the data. The plasma reactor was running on fumes. The fuel rods were depleted. If the reactor stopped, the Geller field would collapse. If the field collapsed, the ship would be torn apart by demons in seconds. They needed fuel. Kane proposed a solution. It was a solution of cold logic. He said the cargo bays were full of biomass. There were thousands of bodies down there. The zombies that had boarded the ship, the guardsmen who had died in the fighting. The biomass could be broken down. It could be converted into promethium sludge. It could be fed into the reactor. It was a desecration of the dead. It was a taboo in the Imperial cult, but it was the only source of fuel they had. Crowley looked to the table. He was a pious man. He knew that burning the bodies of the faithful was a sin, but he also knew that letting the living die was a failure of duty. He looked at Titus. Titus stood with his arms crossed. The Space Marine did not need to eat as often as a human. His armor recycled his waste. But he knew the men could not survive without heat and power. Titus nodded slowly. He said the dead would serve the Emperor one last time. Crowley signed the order. It was a small piece of paper. It was a small choice. He dipped his quill in ink and wrote his name. He authorized the corpse grinders to be activated. He authorized the dead to be shoveled into the furnace. He thought he was saving the ship. He did not know he was signing their death warrant. The order went down to the engine decks. The engineers, half mad from the whispering in the walls, obeyed. They opened the blast doors to the corpse bays. The smell was horrific. It was not just the smell of rot. It was the smell of ozone and old magic. The bodies of the zombies had not decayed normally. They were preserved by the warp energy that had animated them. The engineers used bulldozers to push the piles of limbs and torsos into the grinders. The machines roared. The slurry was pumped into the reactor. The plasma drive ignited. The lights on the ship flared bright. The heat returned. For a moment, the crew cheered. They felt the warmth on their faces. They thought they were saved. But the light was not white. It was a pale, sickly yellow. The hum of the engine changed pitch. It was no longer a mechanical thrum. It sounded like a choir of deep voices singing a discord. Magos Kane was the first to notice the data stream corruption. He was plugged into the manifold. He felt the new fuel hit the core. The fuel was not just organic matter. It was tainted matter. Every cell of those zombies had been touched by the Azkaban curse. Every molecule was infused with the misery of the prison. By burning it, they had released that energy directly into the ship's power grid. They had injected the ghost virus into the veins of the hammer of Dorn. The machine spirit of the battleship screamed. It was a digital scream that overloaded the voxcasters. Every speaker on the ship bled static at maximum volume. Men covered their ears. Glass dials shattered. Then, the ship began to change. The shadows in the corridors detached themselves from the walls. They were no longer 2D shapes. They became 3D forms. They were made of oil and smoke. They were the memories of the dead bodies burning in the reactor. They did not attack physically. They attacked the ship's functions. A shadow drifted into a turret control. The turret spun around. It aimed into the hallway. It fired. A squad of armsmen was cut down by their own ship's gun. The blast doors began to open and close randomly. They crushed crewmen who were walking through. The gravity plating malfunctioned. In Sector 4, gravity reversed. Men fell upward, smashing into the ceiling. In Sector 6, gravity increased 10 times. The men there were flattened into paste on the floor. Crowley watched his ship commit suicide. He realized his mistake. He had fed the beast. He tried to shut down the reactor. He shouted at Kane to cut the fuel feed. Kane tried. He sent the command code. The computer rejected it. The screen displayed text in a language that was not High Gothic. It was a chaotic script. The ship was refusing to die. It enjoyed the taste of the tainted fuel. Titus realized that the bridge was no longer safe. The command throne itself was sparking. The cables were writhing like snakes. He grabbed Crowley and pulled him away just as the console exploded. "We have to go to the engine room," Titus shouted. "We have to kill the reactor manually." They gathered what was left of the command crew. They met up with the Iron Wardens. The journey to the engine room was a descent into hell. The ship was actively hunting them. The lights would turn off when they entered a room. The airlocks would try to suck them into space. They had to hack every door. They had to shoot out the security cameras because the cameras were casting spells. In the mess hall, they found General Stubbs and his men. The guardsmen were huddled in the center of the room. They were surrounded by the kitchen servitors. The servitors were lobotomized cyborgs used for cooking, but the corruption had taken them. The servitors were armed with cleavers and saws. They were butchering the soldiers. Stubbs was fighting back with a soup ladle and a las pistol. Titus charged in. He smashed a servitor with his power boot. He punched another one, shattering its metal skull. The Space Marines cleared the room in seconds. Stubbs looked at Titus. He was covered in blood, but he was grinning maniacally. "The kitchen is closed," he yelled. The stress had finally cracked his mind a little, but he was still a soldier. He rallied his survivors. They joined Titus's group. They reached the engineering deck. The heat was unbearable. The yellow light was blinding. The reactor was pulsing like a giant heart. It was beating. Thump, 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 thump. The walls of the engine room were bleeding. Oil leaked from the pipes, but it flowed up, defying physics. Margos Kane was waiting for them at the control junction. But Kane was not himself. He had reconnected to the ship to try and fight the corruption. He had lost. The corruption had flowed back into him. Kane hung from the ceiling by his mechadendrites. His metal limbs were twitching. His voice box was broadcasting the binary code of the curse. "The flesh is weak," Kane's voice screeched, "but the metal is wicked." Kane's heavy lifting arms struck out. They grabbed a space marine, Brother Solus. They crushed him. The ceramite armor crumpled like paper. Solus died instantly. Kane was now a puppet of the ship. He was the guardian of the reactor. Titus did not hesitate. He could not save the Margos. He ordered his squad to fire. Bolter rounds hit the hanging tech priest. They sparked off his metal casing. Kane laughed. He used the ship's fire suppression system. Jets of chemical foam sprayed the room. It blinded the space marines. Then the repair drones attacked. Flying buzzsaws swarmed out of the vents. It was a chaotic brawl in the foam. Titus swung his chainsword blindly. He hit metal. He hit flesh. He heard Stubbs shouting orders. Form a square, bayonets up. The guardsmen formed a defensive box. They stabbed at the flying drones. Crowley saw the manual override lever for the reactor. It was on a catwalk above the core. It was surrounded by steam vents. Crowley ran for the ladder. A drone slashed his leg. He fell. He crawled. He was an old man, but he was an inquisitor. He had willpower of iron. He dragged himself up the ladder. The heat was melting the soles of his boots. He reached the catwalk. Kane saw him. The corrupted Margot swung a massive pincer arm at Crowley. Titus saw it too. He jumped. He engaged his jump pack for a fraction of a second. He launched himself into the air. He intercepted the pincer arm. He caught it with his hands. The servo motors whined. Titus strained against the machine strength of the Magos. His muscles tore. His bones creaked. But he held the arm back. "Do it, Inquisitor," Titus roared. Crowley grabbed the lever. It was red hot. His skin sizzled. He screamed a prayer to the Emperor. He pulled the lever down. The emergency purge activated. The floor of the reactor chamber opened. The burning fuel, the tainted slurry, and the core itself were ejected. A blast of vacuum sucked the air out of the room. The noise was deafening. The reactor fell away into the warp outside. The ship went dark. The yellow light vanished. The gravity normalized. The screaming stopped. Magos Kane went limp. The animating energy left him. He fell to the floor, a broken pile of junk. The ship was dead in the water. No power. No Geller field. This was the massive outcome. By trying to fuel the ship with the dead, they had forced themselves to kill the ship to save it. Now they had no protection at all. The warp rushed in. It did not come as monsters this time. It came as a vision. The walls of the engine room dissolved. The crew found themselves standing not on metal, but on a plain of grey dust. The sky above was purple and bruised. They were hallucinating. The Geller field failure had merged their minds with the Immaterium. Titus looked around. He saw the faces of his dead squad members. He saw the three-headed dog. He saw the Necrons. They were ghosts of his memory. He knew this was a test. If he believed the illusion, he would die. He shouted to his men, "It is not real. Hold on to your duty. Duty is the anchor." Crowley stood in the dust. He saw a throne. On the throne sat a golden figure. It looked like the Emperor. The figure smiled at him. It offered him a cup of wine. It offered him rest. Crowley wanted to take it. He was so tired. He took a step forward. Then a hand grabbed his shoulder. It was General Stubbs. Stubbs was smoking his cigar, which was somehow lit in this dream world. "That ain't him, Chief," Stubbs said. "The Emperor doesn't offer wine. He offers ammunition." Stubbs's crude pragmatism broke the spell. The golden figure hissed and turned into a serpent. Crowley backed away. They needed to restart the backup generators. But they were in a dream. How do you fix a machine in a dream? You have to dream it fixed. Titus understood. The warp reacted to will. They had to impose their will on reality. They had to believe the ship was working. "Imagine the engine," Titus commanded. "Visualize the piston. Visualize the spark." The Space Marines closed their eyes. They focused their disciplined minds on the image of a promethium generator. They chanted the litany of ignition. The guardsmen joined in. They hummed the sound of a running engine. The collective willpower of 500 survivors focused on one idea: power. In the warp, thought is action. A spark flared in the grey void. A generator materialized out of the mist. It sputtered. It roared to life. The dream shattered. They were back in the engineering deck. The emergency lights flickered on. The backup generator was running. It was small. It wasn't enough for the engines or the weapons, but it was enough for the Geller field. The field re-established itself with a snap of ozone. The warp was pushed back outside. They were safe, for now. But they were drifting. They had no main drive. They were becalmed in the deep warp. This was a death sentence. Without a drive, they could not reach a jump point. They would float here until they starved or went mad. Then, the astropath spoke. He had been carried down on a stretcher. He was blind and weak. He pointed at the floor. "Underneath," he whispered. "There is a current." Crowley leaned in. "What do you mean?" "A current," the astropath rasped. "A deep stream, the River of Souls. It flows somewhere." Titus looked at the sensors. There was a gravitational pull. It was weak, but it was there. It wasn't a planet. It was awake. Something massive had passed through here recently. Something that left a tunnel in the warp. The Necron ship, Titus realized. The pyramid. It jumped. This is its wake. The Necron ship used inertialess drives. It didn't travel through the warp like human ships. It punched a tunnel through it. The tunnel was closing, but it was still there. It was a slipstream. If they could get the ship into that stream, the current would carry them. They wouldn't need engines. They would surf the wake of the tomb ship. "Where did the Necron ship go?" Crowley asked. "It went home," Titus said. "To its dynasty." "So we follow it?" Stubbs asked. "We hitch a ride with the murder machines to their home planet?" "That sounds like a bad plan." "It is the only plan," Titus said. "Here, we die. There we fight. I choose to fight." Crowley nodded. He agreed. He ordered the thrusters to fire. They used the last drops of chemical fuel to nudge the hammer of Dorn. The ship drifted sideways. It caught the edge of the invisible river. The ship shuddered as it was grabbed by the current. It accelerated, faster and faster. The stars outside smeared into green streaks. They were riding the Necron highway. The speed was impossible. The ship groaned. Metal plates sheared off. The journey took hours, but it felt like seconds. They were being pulled across the galaxy. Suddenly, the ride stopped. The ship was spat out of the warp. They slammed back into real space. The inertial dampeners failed. Everyone was thrown to the floor. Silence returned to the bridge. The viewports opened. They looked out. They were not in the Imperium. The stars were strange. In front of them hung a planet. It was a dead world. It was made of black metal and glowing green glass. It was a Necron crown world. And orbiting the world were thousands of ships. Crescents of doom, pyramids of death. It was a Necron fleet large enough to conquer a segmentum. And in the center of the fleet was the Azkaban pyramid. It had arrived before them. The hammer of Dorn drifted toward the alien armada. It was a broken, rusting hulk. It looked like a piece of space junk. "They see us," the sensor officer whispered. "Target locks. Thousands of them." Crowley stood up. He smoothed his tattered coat. He put his rosette back on his chest. "Open a channel," he said. "To who?" the officer asked. "To the Silent King," Crowley said. "Or whoever rules this graveyard. We are not here to surrender. We are here to trade." "Trade what?" Titus asked. Crowley looked at the data slate in his hand. It contained the scans of the abomination. It contained the data of the warp rift. It contained the secret that the Necrons feared most, the return of the Chaos Gods in a way that biology could not stop. "We have information," Crowley said. "The Necrons hate chaos. We hate chaos. For today, that makes us allies. Or at least, it might make them curious enough not to vaporize us instantly." The screen showed the green lights of the Necron weapons charging up. There was no guarantee of torque. There was only the cold certainty that the story was about to end, one way or another. The green light from the Necron fleet washed over the bridge of the Hammer of Dorn. It was bright enough to read by. The crew stood at their stations. They did not move. They held their breath. They waited for the particle beams to turn them into atoms. But the beams did not fire. The silence stretched out for 1 minute, then 2. The tension was heavier than gravity. General Stubbs lit a new cigar. His hands were shaking, but he hid it well. He puffed smoke into the recycled air. He looked at the view screen. He said that if they were going to kill them, they were taking a long time to do it. Inquisitor Crowley did not look away from the sensor panel. He watched the energy spikes. The Necron ships were communicating with each other. It was a digital conversation happening at the speed of light. They were debating the fate of the humans. Crowley knew that Necrons were not like orcs or tyrannids. They did not kill for fun or hunger. They killed for logic. He had to give them a logic that ended in survival. A sound cut through the bridge. It was a high-pitched chime. The main hololith table activated on its own. The machine spirit of the ship had been bypassed. A face appeared in the green light of the hologram. It was a metal skull. It wore a headdress of gold and jade. Its eyes were burning with emerald fire. It was the Pharaon, the lord of this dynasty. The Pharaon spoke. The voice did not come from the speakers. It came from inside their heads. It was a telepathic translation of binary code. The voice was cold. It sounded like 2 glaciers grinding together. The Pharaon demanded to know why the vermin had brought the stench of the warp to his kingdom. He demanded to know why he should not vaporize their ship to sterilize the void. Crowley stepped forward. He stood in front of the hologram. He straightened his back. He was a small human in front of a giant projection, but he spoke with the authority of the Inquisition. He said they did not bring the warp. They were fleeing it. He said the Azkaban rift was open. He said the chaos entity known as the Abomination was eating the sector. He uploaded the data of the rift's growth rate. He showed the Necron Lord that the rift was expanding exponentially. In 1 year, it would swallow this system too. The Pharaon was silent. The hologram flickered as he processed the data. The Necrons hated the warp. It was the one thing their science could not fully control. It was the antithesis of their order. The Pharaon analyzed the trajectory of the rift. He saw that the human was telling the truth. The rift was a cancer, and it was spreading fast. The hologram changed. It showed a map of the galaxy. It showed the green territory of the Necrons and the purple stain of the rift. The Pharaon spoke again. He said the humans were primitive. Their attempts to close the rift with a bomb had only made it worse. He called them children playing with a loaded gun. But he admitted that the threat was real. He said he would not help them out of kindness. He would help them to protect his own borders. Then came the offer. It was not a negotiation. It was a command. The Pharaon said his cryptex possessed a device. It was a null matrix generator. It was similar to the pylons of Cadian. It could seal a breach in reality. But the device was heavy. It needed a delivery system. It needed to be taken into the heart of the rift and detonated. The Necrons would not risk their own ships for this suicide mission. They would use the human ship. Crowley understood the implication. The Hammer of Dorn was to be the delivery system. The Pharaon would repair their engines. He would install the null matrix. Then the humans would fly back into the hell they just escaped. They would fly into the center of the abomination and activate the device. It would kill them all, but it would save the sector. Crowley looked at Titus. The Space Marine captain understood. It was a one-way trip. Titus nodded. It was a good death. It was better than starving in the void. Crowley looked at the Pharaon. He accepted the terms. The hologram vanished. The green lights of the Necron fleet dimmed. The weapons powered down. Then a new activity began. Small constructs flew out of the Necron pyramids. They were scarabs, millions of them. They looked like a swarm of metallic beetles. They flew toward the hammer of Dorn. They landed on the hull. The sound was like heavy rain. The scarabs began to eat the damaged metal. But they were not destroying it. They were reforming it. They broke down the rust and the fatigue. They rewove the atomic structure of the steel. They patched the holes in the armor. They crawled into the engine nozzles. They rebuilt the plasma injectors with living metal. Inside the ship, the crew watched in amazement. The walls stopped bleeding oil. The lights turned from yellow to a crisp, clean white. The air recyclers hummed with efficiency. The temperature stabilized. In 1 hour, the Necron nanobots did what the Adeptus Mechanicus could not do in a century. They restored the ship. But it was no longer purely Imperial. The corridors now had the hexagonal patterns of the Necrons. The consoles glowed green instead of red. The machine spirit of the ship was silent. It had been replaced or suppressed by the alien code. A transport beam hit the cargo deck. A massive object materialized. It was a black obelisk. It hummed with a frequency that made teeth ache. This was the null matrix. It was the bomb that would kill the warp. Magos Kane's replacement, a junior tech priest named Alpha 7, looked at the device with fear. He refused to touch it. He said it was heretic. Titus told him to be quiet. Heresy was a luxury for the living. They were already walking dead. The repairs were finished. The scarabs flew back to their masters. The Pharaon hailed them one last time. He gave them the coordinates of the rift's center. He told them they had 3 solar days before the expansion became irreversible. He told them to leave his system immediately. If they returned, they would be destroyed. The hammer of Dorn turned around. The engines fired. This time, the thrust was smooth and powerful. The Necron upgrades had given the ship a speed it never had before. They did not need the warp to travel. They used the residual inertia of the Necron drive. They shot out of the system like a bullet. The journey back was quiet. The crew knew where they were going. They were soldiers. They spent the time writing letters that no one would ever read. They cleaned their uniforms. They prayed. General Stubbs went to the mess hall. He opened the last crate of Amasek brandy. He poured a drink for every man in his regiment. He toasted to the Emperor. He toasted to Cadian. He toasted to the crazy Inquisitor who got them into this mess. Captain Titus spent the time in the Strategium. He studied the tactical map of the rift. The abomination was still there. It had grown. It was no longer just a monster made of the black ship. It had absorbed the asteroids and debris of the system. It was a planet-sized mass of flesh and metal. It sat in the center of the purple storm, like a spider in a web. They arrived at the edge of the rift. The view was terrifying. The stars were gone. There was only the swirling madness of the warp bleeding into reality. The abomination sensed them. It remembered them. It roared on the psychic spectrum. The astropath on the bridge screamed and died. His brain melted. Crowley stepped over the body. He ordered the ship to advance. The battle began. The abomination launched its weapons. It fired spurts of magma and soul fire. It launched boarding pods made of bone. The hammer of Dorn fought back. The Necron upgrades had improved the weapons too. The macro cannons fired green lightning. The lance batteries cut through the warp shields of the beast. Stubbs led the defense of the interior. The boarding pods crashed through the hull. Demons poured out. They were red and wet. They had too many eyes. The Imperial Guard met them with laser guns and bayonets. The corridors became kill zones. Stubbs fought with his power sword. He cut down a bloodletter. He shouted defiance. "Not today. You don't get us today." Titus and his squad stayed on the upper decks. They had to protect the bridge. The abomination sent its elites. Chaos Space Marines from the Black Legion, who had been hiding in the rift, boarded the ship. They were led by a champion of Khorne. He wore brass armor. He wielded an axe that dripped blood. Titus met the champion in the main atrium. The duel was brutal. The Chaos Marine was faster, fueled by the power of the warp. He struck Titus in the chest. The breastplate cracked. Titus fell. The champion raised his axe for the killing blow. But Titus was not alone. Inquisitor Crowley was there. He fired his plasma pistol. The bolt of blue sun hit the champion in the face. It burned through his helmet. The champion staggered. Titus swept his leg. He knocked the traitor down. He drove his chainsword into the gap in the neck armor. The champion died. "Get up, Captain," Crowley said. He offered a hand. "We have a delivery to make." The ship was taking heavy damage. The Necron armor was strong, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. The void shields were collapsing. They were 10 kilometers from the center of the entity. They needed to get the null matrix inside the beast. "Ramming speed," Crowley ordered. The helm officer hesitated. "Sir." "You heard me," Crowley said. "Aim for the mouth. Ramming speed." The hammer of Dorn accelerated. It became a spear. It flew through the storm of fire. It crashed into the flesh of the abomination. The impact was sickening. It sounded like meat being crushed. The ship buried itself deep inside the monster's body. The ship stopped. They were inside. The viewport showed pulsing walls of muscle and machinery. The heat was intense. The hull integrity was at 0. The ship was breaking apart. "Activate the matrix," Crowley said. Tech Priest Alpha 7 typed the command. The black obelisk in the cargo bay began to hum. It opened. A sphere of absolute blackness appeared in its center. It was a singularity. The abomination felt the foreign object in its gut. It screamed. It tried to crush the ship. The walls of the room buckled. Gravity failed. But the matrix did its work. It pulsed. The pulse was not explosive. It was reductive. It erased reality. It expanded outward. It touched the flesh of the demon. The flesh vanished. It touched the warp energy. The energy was grounded. The reaction spread. The abomination began to dissolve. It was being unmade. The rift around it began to shrink. The purple storm turned grey, then black. The physics of the materium were reasserting themselves. On the bridge, the crew watched the end. The light of the matrix was swallowing the ship. They held hands. They did not scream. They faced the light. But the Necrons had one last trick. The Pharaon had not told them everything. The null matrix was not just a bomb. It was a tesseract, a prison. As the singularity expanded, it did not kill the crew. It froze them. Time stopped on the hammer of Dorn. The explosion paused mid-detonation. The crumbling walls halted. The dying soldiers in the hallways froze in place. On Inesidin, the ship, the abomination, and the center of the rift were pulled into the black sphere. The sphere collapsed in on itself. It shrank to the size of a marble. Then it vanished from the sector. The rift closed. The stars returned. The Azkaban system was empty. The prison tower was gone. The fleet was gone. The monster was gone. There was only silence and the cold dust of space. Years passed. The sector recovered. The records of the Azkaban incident were sealed by the Inquisition. The names of Crowley, Titus, and Stubbs were erased from the archives. They were not listed as heroes. They were listed as lost to the warp. But deep in the infinite galleries of Solemnes, a Necron tomb world far away, a new exhibit was added. Trazyn the Infinite, the great collector of history, walked through his museum. He stopped in front of a massive display case. It was a tesseract labyrinth. Inside the stasis field, frozen in a single moment of eternal heroism, was the bridge of the Hammer of Dorn. Trazyn looked at the frozen figures. He saw the Inquisitor with his hand on the console. He saw the Space Marine captain with his battered armor. He saw the general lighting a cigar. He saw the fear and the courage on the faces of the crew. The Necron collector adjusted the lighting of the display. He was pleased. It was a rare set. A perfect moment of human defiance captured forever. He read the plaque he had written for the exhibit. The Saviors of the Azkaban Rift. Acquired M41. The humans were not dead. They were not alive. They were statues in a museum of the galaxy's history. They would stand there for 1,000,000 years, unaware that the battle was over, unaware that they had won. This was the convergence. The inescapable offer had been a trap of preservation. The Necrons had saved the galaxy from the rift, but they had claimed the heroes as trophies. The camera of history pulled back. The gallery of Trazyn was endless. There were armies of orcs, regiments of guard, and heroes of old. The Hammer of Dorn was just one more piece in the collection. The lights in the museum dimmed. The silence of the tomb was absolute. The story of the Azkaban breach was over. The prisoners were still in prison, just a different kind. A prison of glass and gold, watched over by a metal skeleton who appreciated the irony. The threat was neutralized. The Imperium continued its slow, grinding war. The High Lords of Terror never knew how close they came to the end. And somewhere in the stasis field, General Stubbs' cigar smoke hung in the air, a grey cloud that would never dissipate, a monument to a soldier who refused to blink in the dark. 200 years after the disappearance of the Hammer of Dorn, a scribe named Valerius sat in the dusty archives of the Sector Solar. His job was to catalogue the losses of the Departmental Munitorum. He worked by the light of a single flickering lumen strip. The air in the archive smelled of dry paper and old ink. Valerius was tired. He had been working for 16 hours. He picked up a data slate that was marked for deletion. It was a casualty report from the Azkaban subsector. The file was corrupt. Most of the text was blacked out by the seal of the Inquisition. But Valerius was curious. He had a talent for decoding. He plugged the slate into his cogitator. He bypassed the logic locks. He wanted to know where 1 billion credits worth of equipment had gone. The screen flickered. A fragment of an audio file played. It was full of static, but through the white noise a voice spoke. It was a rough voice, chewing on words like they were tobacco. The voice said that they were holding the line. It said that the kitchen was closed. Valerius did not understand the code. He dug deeper. He found a video file. It was grainy and dark. It showed a ship ramming a monster. It showed a flash of green light. And then, for a single frame, it showed the bridge of the ship frozen in time. Valerius paused the image. He zoomed in. He saw the faces of the men. They did not look like dead men. They looked like they were waiting. Valerius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's temperature. He realized he was looking at a ghost story. The official record said the Azkaban fleet was lost to a warp storm. They said the sector was quarantined due to a plague. But this data showed something else. It showed a deliberate erasure. It showed that the Imperium had sold its own heroes to an alien collector to buy safety. The scribe felt a sudden weight in his stomach. He knew he had seen something forbidden. He reached for the delete key. He wanted to wipe the memory. He wanted to go back to his ignorance. The door to the archive slid open. Valerius jumped. A figure stood in the doorway. He wore a long leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in shadow. He was an agent of the throne. He did not hold a weapon, but his presence was a threat. He walked to the desk. He looked at the screen. He looked at Valerius. The agent did not ask questions. He knew what the scribe had found. The Inquisition always knew. The data slate had a silent alarm. The agent spoke softly. He said that curiosity was a defect. He said that truth was a commodity that had to be rationed. He reached out and turned off the cogitator. The image of the frozen crew vanished. The room went dark. The agent told Valerius to stand up. He said there was a vacancy in the servitor factory on the lower levels. They needed units that could process data without asking why. Valerius tried to speak. He tried to explain, but his voice failed him. 2 stormtroopers entered the room. They grabbed the scribe by the arms. They dragged him away. The agent picked up the data slate. He crushed it in his mechanical hand. The plastic shattered. The memory chip snapped. The last record of General Stubbs and Captain Titus was destroyed. The agent dropped the pieces into the waste chute. He adjusted his gloves. He walked out of the archive. The lights turned off automatically. The dust settled back onto the shelves. In the vastness of the Imperium, 1 trillion souls lived and died every day. The loss of one scribe was a rounding error. The loss of one battleship was a statistic. The galaxy did not care about heroism. It only cared about survival. The Azkaban incident remained a secret. The rift stayed closed. The planets in the sector were recolonized. Farmers tilled the soil where zombies had once marched. Children played in the ruins of the landing zones, unaware that beneath the earth lay the bones of the Cadian 88th. The peace was real, but it was built on a foundation of lies. Far away, in the silence of the museum, the exhibit remained unchanged. The cigar smoke did not fade. The bolt shell did not fall. The heroes stood their eternal watch, preserved in the amber of alien technology. They were the only ones who knew the truth, and they could never speak it. The universe moved on, grinding forward on the gears of war, leaving its saviors behind in the dark. This was the final mercy of the 41st millennium. You are not remembered for how you lived. You are only remembered for how useful you were when you died. And for the crew of the Hammer of Dorn, their usefulness was eternal.